Hi, welcome to History 1302. This is lecture 10. This is the Great Depression and New Deal. At the end of the last lecture, I mentioned that the 1920s ended with that breaking, essentially, of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party was going to be meaningless in politics in both the 1924 and 1928 elections. And I mentioned that it would take a massive crisis in order to get the Democratic Party to be revitalized. Well, that massive crisis was the Great Depression. And the Great Depression is yet another moment in American history that we can probably, I think, justifiably call a traumatic moment for Americans. It's a moment that caused Americans to question everything about themselves. Americans lost everything in the Great Depression. They lost all of their cash. They lost all of their savings. They lost jobs. When jobs did become available, there were more job applicants than there were actual jobs. It cost people their homes. It led to people literally picking up and moving across the country in search of jobs, in search of anything that would bring them any semblance of success. It disrupted American families, as in a lot of cases. We saw men literally leaving their families, not just because they were out on a job search, literally moving across the country seeking jobs, but there's also sort of a cultural issue here. In the last lecture, I talked about the domestic sphere. Well, the opposite the counter to that was the male sphere, and the male sphere held that men were the ones who took care of their families. They brought the money home, they provided. And a lot of men, from a psychological perspective, felt simply broken over the inability to provide for their families. So a lot of them simply took off, thinking their families would be better off without them until they could at least find some sort of a job. And again, when jobs did come, and they came too infrequently, they also came with way too many applicants. There just were not enough jobs to keep up with the populace. And ultimately, what Americans did was they started turning to, at least for Americans of this era, they started turning to radicalism. Franklin D. Roosevelt and the solutions that he comes up with that are referred to as the New Deal are not necessarily radical by today's standards. And even during his own time, from a global perspective, they weren't terribly radical. But for American society, they were incredibly radical. So Americans turned to him and turned to the ideas of radicalism in order to escape the worst parts of the Great Depression. Now, people also, in this moment where investment in the economy goes from or drops by 98%, when we see unemployment skyrocket to 25%, we also see Americans finding escape in other ways. Americans escaped through film, and due to copyright issues, I can't put clips of these famous films in these YouTube videos. But some of the most important films in American history, because of their cultural commentary, were made during the Great Depression. Movies like Gold Diggers of 1933, movies like Little Caesar, which glorified an organized crime lifestyle, movies like I'm a Fugitive from a Chain Gang. These types of movies talked about people who were escaping the depths of the Great Depression by turning to all sorts of other options. Gold Diggers means the same today that it meant in 1933. These were women who were glorified because they married rich men simply for money. I'm a Fugitive from a Chain Gang is a story about a guy who escaped from prison and worked under an assumed identity and kind of rehabilitated who he was, and that all falls apart when he gets discovered. These movies that I'm talking about kept alive a very important notion in American society. They twisted it a little bit, as we're going to see, but they kept alive something called the Horatio Alger myth. Horatio Alger was a novelist from the 1890s. And he wrote a number of books during that era. They were called dime novels, sold mostly at drugstores and stuff like that. He wrote these novels that he called novels for boys. And every single one of these novels was basically the same novel. The industry might change, the main character's name obviously would change, and some of the smaller details would change, but there's a sort of basic premise to each one of these novels. There would be this poor young man who would go to work in a factory, and because of his hard work and a little bit of luck, he would impress and ultimately kind of rise up the ladder in that factory. He'd also, because of this stuff, he would impress the daughter of the person who owned the factory or the person who owned the business. He'd wind up marrying this girl, and ultimately he'd wind up running the company. The message in every single one of these novels is that hard work will actually pay off. Hard work gets you everywhere. So it doesn't matter if you're born poor. If you work really hard, you will rise up. You will ascend the corporate ladder, or you will ascend in the factory structure and wind up running the whole place. Now, during the Great Depression, this whole idea of working hard and being rewarded for that and being successful because of that, that's challenged because people were literally losing everything they had during the Great Depression. But the movies of the Great Depression era kept this myth alive, even if they twisted it a little bit. I'm a fugitive from a chain gang. That guy, the main character in that movie, may have had to have changed his identity. He may have had to do all sorts of sketchy things to survive, but he did, and he prospered in the aftermath of that. In Little Caesar, the main character is an impoverished young man who turns to organized crime. He's actually very good at what he does. He makes a ton of money. He gets his mother out of poverty and buys her own home and all of this. Again, his hard work in this sort of other way paid off for him, just like gold diggers of 1933. These women may not have been employing traditional methods of hard work, but their industriousness in other ways led to success for them. Now, there's also a sort of semblance of justice that's going to have to play out in all of this, because the idea of hard work paying off gets twisted around a little bit. These people also have to pay a price. So, for example, at the end of I'm a Fugitive from a Chain Gang, the main character loses everything and winds up having to go back on the run. In Little Caesar, the main character winds up getting assassinated and literally dumped on the doorstep of his mother. He winds up having to pay a price for all of this stuff. So the Great Depression the movies of the Great Depression kept this idea of hard work alive, the basis of the American dream, that if you work really hard, you will be successful. It sticks around, but it does wind up getting twisted just a little bit. Now, when we look at the Great Depression, the big theme of the Great Depression and how it happens is people who are taking a marketplace and just kind of blowing the entire thing out of proportion and winding up creating a sort of monster, if you will. And no single individual exemplified this more than a guy named Samuel Insel. Samuel Insel was the personal secretary at one point to Thomas Edison. Now, this is not the position of being the personal secretary is not what we think of today when we think of secretaries. We think of administrative assistants. This is a little bit more involved, and it's kind of the person who's the personal secretary to a guy like Thomas Edison is going to literally be working side by side with him. So calling him a personal secretary doesn't give Insel his just due for what his contributions to Edison's inventions actually were. Edison had actually invented the light bulb, and Insel was involved in that project. And Insel, along with others, pointed out to Edison that this is all well and good that you've created this light bulb, but without an electrical delivery system, this light bulb is meaningless. It's not going to give any benefit to anyone. Insel is going to be the person who creates the electrical delivery system. He literally creates the basis for the current national power grid that operates in the United States. He, along with several other of Edison's employees, set up a company called Edison General Electric. And as part of this company, Insel wound up rising to the position of vice president. After Insel got together with other businessmen, he helped create this merger of several other electrical companies owned by people like J.P. Morgan and several others. And they created the modern company called General Electric. Now, strangely enough, Insel wound up finding himself, even though he created the merger that created General Electric, he found himself on the outside of this whole business relationship and decided that's fine. And he decides to move to Chicago, where he decided he's going to build his own electrical empire. Again, using Edison's name in the process, he creates a company called Western Edison, which through a series of mergers and the like, becomes known as Chicago Edison. By the 19 teens, the company that Insel created, Western Edison, provided 12% of the nation's electricity. And by the 1920s, there were really only two companies that were of any consequence in electricity: General Electric and Western Edison. Now, Insel understood that you don't build an empire by being a nice guy. Insel, among other flaws, was incredibly arrogant. When politicians and labor leaders would get in his way, he simply bought them off. He viewed laborers as very little more than hired hands. When the city of Chicago placed impediments in his way, he got his lawyer appointed to the city council in Chicago, and this essentially gave him free rein to do what he wanted with his company. His company over time developed into the biggest supplier of power in the nation. And in the process, Insel developed a lot of enemies as well. Obviously, one of them was the guy who had forced him out at Edison General Electric, that being J.P. Morgan. On top of this, Insel also understood something fundamental about business at the time, and I would suggest to you it's kind of fundamental today as well. You don't build these types of businesses. You don't build these massive empires by putting your own money into this. There was even a satirical movie made about this called Other People's Money. He built this company, Western Edison, on a mountain of debt. There was massive amounts of debt built into this. And basically how Insel did this was he wound up going to banks and getting borrowing large amounts of money. And when he hit the borrowing maximums, the banks understood that Insel was good, that what he did was always profitable. So what they told him is, yeah, you've hit the maximum for this company, but if you create another company, we'll allow you to borrow more money for that new company. And what Insel wound up doing was creating essentially an economic shell game, okay, where these different companies are all associated with a sort of founding company, if you will. And then what they do is they take the money that they've borrowed from banks and they loan it out to each other, shuffling the debt around so that when people come in and want to see the books, they're always looking at a series of shuffling debts, shuffling assets, and the like. It's literally referred to as a shell corp. These companies are literally referred to as shell corporations because what they're doing is essentially the same as a shell game, where you put the little ball under a shell and you just move the shells around to try to hide which shell the ball is actually under. In this case, the ball is debt, okay? And those companies are the shells. So every single year that these companies were in operation, Insel looked like a genius because he could hide the debts, he could hide all of the assets when he needed to, he could make companies look more profitable than they were, and it got him a ton of money. He offered stock in Western Edison what we would today call an initial public offering. He offered it at $12 a share. And by the time the first day's trading was over, it was trading at $30. So think about that. You get in the morning. By the time the market closes, you've doubled your money. If you're an investor, you love Samuel Insel. In the summer of 1929, Western Edison was trading at $529 a share. And then the stock market crashed in 1929, October of 1929, which we'll get to. The stock market crashed. And as that market declined and declined and declined, it became clearer that Samuel Insel's company was essentially a massive corporate pyramid scheme, that there was no real asset, that there was just tons and tons of debt. Now, as it turns out, the only thing that would solve the debt was a massive infusion of cash. And there was literally only one bank that could have bailed out Western Edison. That bank was a bank called National City. It was a precursor to today's Citibank. That bank at the moment happened to have been owned by J.P. Morgan. However, when faced with the prospect of bailing out his rival or simply letting his company fall apart, Morgan said, let him go down. So Insel wound up with his company collapsing. He was completely insolvent, and Insel wound up not being charged and not having to face any charges over this, largely because he ran off to Paris and escaped the worst of this. He still wound up penniless and died completely broke, but he wound up not being charged with anything in terms of a confidence game or anything. Now, the Great Depression in part came about because of stories of guys like Samuel Insel and our next guy, Charles Ponzi. Charles Ponzi was a genius and a con artist. He gave his name to a scheme, the Ponzi scheme. What Charles Ponzi was telling investors is that if you give me $1,500, if you give me $1,000, I'll give you $500 I'll give you $1,500 in 90 days. That's a 50% return on investment. You give him $1,000 in 90 days, he gives you 1,500. You haven't quite doubled your money, but you've gotten half of your money on top of your initial investment. So this is a really good deal. It seems to work out. Now, he would take money from investors and then he would give it back to people in terms of, he would give it back in the order that they invested. So it was important for what Ponzi was doing. It was important to have a constant stream of new investors. People had to constantly be investing with him. And he's supposedly investing in the stock market with him, with these people's money. Now, as long as people are continuing to come in, as long as they're continuing to plunk down $1,000 to invest, Ponzi's going to be fine. At the height of this quote unquote scheme, the first so-called Ponzi scheme, he was bringing in $1 million a week. But the problem for Ponzi was that he ran out of suckers. There weren't enough people to continue doing all of this. And those who came in toward the end of this scheme wound up getting nothing. Altogether, Charles Ponzi brought in $15 million that he was supposedly investing in the stock market on these people's behalf. And eventually he only paid out about $200,000 to people. And the reason was he was spending all of this money on all sorts of other things, luxury vehicles, houses, clothes, all sorts of stuff for his own personal gain. There was a sort of runaway speculative mania in the United States that caused this problem. Charles Ponzi wasn't just coming out of nowhere and saying, invest in the stock market, and people went, oh, okay, let's do that. What's happening is that Charles Ponzi was preying on their speculative mania. These people looked at the stock market. They heard that the stock market supposedly would pay off in a big way, and Ponzi essentially convinced them to give to him. Now, why people were so convinced of this? They're convinced it's going to pay off because what they're hearing in the news every single day is that you can't lose in the stock market. And I'm not going to ask you for any test or quiz or anything. I'm not going to ask you to remember the values of stocks. But I want you to see on the screen here, you can see that in a 6-month period from March of 1928 to September of 1928, that's a year before the stock market crashed. Just look what companies like AT&T and General Motors were doing. AT&T went from $179 a share to $335 a share. General Motors from $135 to $181. Think about Insel's Western Edison that I talked about a few minutes ago. Initial public offering at $12. It's trading at $30 by the day's end. By 1928, it's trading at $529 a share. It looks like you cannot lose. Every investor seemed to be winning, which made everybody think, well, if you invest in the stock market, you have to be smart. Now, if we look at the overall value of the stock market had increased by the fall of 1929, right before the crash. The stock market had increased by 400%. What this is in economic terms, this is a bubble. Okay. What's happening is you start out with a realistically sized marketplace, and as more people invest, it gets bigger, and more people invest, it gets bigger. And as more people invest, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. But think of it like bubble gum, or if you ever blown bubbles out in the yard when you were a kid, or if you have kids and you do that stuff. Think about what happens with those bubbles. The bigger a bubble gets, the more unstable it gets. So the more people buying into the stock market, and however they're doing it, the more people buying in, the more those values are going to go up, the more inflated the values are going to be, and the more unstable that bubble gets. Now, what contributed to the instability was in part that people were buying on margin. Now, margin purchases were and are, they're still legal. I don't want to make it sound like they're not, but margin purchases are problematic in the stock market. You do not have to have the money to purchase the stocks. You borrow the money. An investor who's buying on margin borrows the money to buy the stocks. Now, think about how this would work. If you've borrowed $1,000 to buy the stocks, those stocks are the basis for your loan. Okay, they're the collateral for your loan. So theoretically, if you've borrowed $1,000, you buy $1,000 worth of stock, as long as at the end of the day's closing, those stocks are worth $1,000, you're fine. But if they're not, if they're worth a little bit less, let's say instead of $1,000, they're only worth $900. The bank is going to come to the margin purchaser. They're going to have to meet what's called a margin call. That's the difference between the money that they've borrowed and what the value of their investment is. Okay. Now I'm using small numbers. They borrowed $1,000, but their investment is only worth $900. So in order to meet the margin call, that investor is going to have to kick in $1,000 to make the investment and the loan match. Okay. Now, if the next day something happens and the stock drops to $800, well, then once again, that person is going to have to meet the margin call, which is now $200. And they're going to have to put it up to bring the investment and the loan to the same value. This allows a lot of people, purchase on margin allows a lot of people to to buy stocks. This is what causes that bubble, that inflation. Think about stocks just like any other commodity, whether it's eyeglasses, ties, computers, cell phones, whatever. The stocks are a commodity. If more and more people are buying the stocks, generally speaking, just take it like a big pool of stocks. If more people are buying the stocks, there's fewer stocks available. And when there's fewer stocks available, the value of the stocks generally goes up. Okay. So Everybody's buying in. People who actually have the cash to do it, people who are borrowing money to do it, and it's causing the values of stocks to go up and up and up and up because there are fewer stocks available. So everything is looking rosy. Everything looks great. It appears that the stock market is going gonzo. There was even an article written by a Yale economist that said the head of the Democratic National Committee that said everyone ought to be rich. The only warning was coming from a Yale economist who said that the stocks have plateaued. They're not going to go up any further. They've reached a permanently high plateau. Now just think about common sense. If something is plateaued, if it's reached its highest point, like a stock has reached its highest point, there's only one place to go, down. Okay. And that's what starts to happen here. Stocks are a theoretical on some level. If you buy stocks and you've got a bunch of stock certificates and you've bought each one of those certificates at $100 each, and you've bought $100,000 worth of stocks, the value is only theoretical. You only have $100,000 if you can actually sell those stocks to somebody. Okay. Otherwise, it's just theoretical money. It's not a liquid asset. It's just theoretical wealth. On October 24th, 1929, the price of stocks began to drop. It was a small decline at first. People were starting to sell off their stocks on the basis of this understanding that they've reached the permanently high plateau. So the only place to go is down. So we got to start getting rid of some of this. So they started to drop. They dropped slowly. But then by noon, the stock market cratered. Within 3 hours, $11 billion. That's contemporaneous. That's not adjusted for inflation. You can see the figure adjusted for inflation in the parentheses. $11 billion in 1929 currency just vanished in the stock market. The New York Stock Exchange got together and decided we need to halt trading right now to stop these losses. While they halted the trading, a bunch of the members of the New York Stock Exchange and a number of Wall Street bankers got together. Each entity involved put up $200 million to shore up prices. Essentially what they did, was they created a big buying consortium. All of these bankers and stockbrokers got together and just started buying up stocks, because if you buy them, it's going to cause the price of these stocks to go up. And it seemed to work. Within 1 hour of reopening the New York Stock Exchange, U.S. Steel went up by $15, AT&T went up by $22, General Electric went up by $21. But there was a lot of nervousness and there was a lot of fear in the market. To try to quell some of this stuff, the President of the United States, a guy named Herbert Hoover, went on radio and assured Americans that the fundamental business of the United States is sound, that this is nothing to worry about. Over the weekend, stock prices seemed to hold steady in the face of foreign markets. But on Monday, October 28th, the prices started to dip again, and people started to really fear for what was going on. And Tuesday, October 29th, the whole thing fell apart. There was a massive rush to sell, and the market dropped even further than it did on the 24th. 88% of the value in the stock exchange gone overnight. This time, it was $200 billion. Again, that's contemporaneous dollars. Adjusted for inflation, I'm going to actually cite this one now. I'm going to say this one now. The amount of dollars of value lost on that one day, October 29th, 1929, was the equivalent today of just over $2.25 trillion. The effects were devastating about all of this stuff. Unemployment in the United States wound up going virtually overnight from 3% to 25%. It was connected to the problem of industrial production. In the United States, when the stock market started to crash, first of all, a number of companies went out of business, which contributed to unemployment. A number of manufacturers looked at this and said, well, with the stock market collapsing, nobody's going to buy anything. So they simply shut down production or cut their production quotas in their factories. And when they cut production quotas, they laid off workers. So overnight, the unemployment numbers went up to 25%, courtesy of industrial production decreasing by 50%. And as I mentioned before, at the outset of this, the investment in the United States economy dropped by 98%. People simply stopped investing in the stock market. They did not see the value in it once it collapsed. Now, the big question is, why did the economy collapse? Why did the Great Depression, as it started being known, why did it last so long? Now, we can look at the stock market crash and say the stock market crash is one factor, and it is one factor, but it's not the only factor. When a lot of people think about the past, what we like is to say, well, this is the cause. But in the case of the Great Depression, it's not just one cause. It's a number of causes that led into each other. They frequently mirrored one another. They had different effects on different parts of the economy. So it's not simple enough to just say, that's it. That's the one cause. The stock market crash was bad, but it's not the only factor. There were other factors. For example, there was something called the Florida land boom that occurred between 1925 and 1927. This was a precursor to the stock market in that, obviously, since it happened from 25 to 27, it's before the stock market crash. But it was kind of a warning about what would happen in the stock market because of the similarities with the stock market crash. The difference here is that the commodity in the Florida land boom is land, not stocks, but the same process occurred. People looked at Florida. Florida wasn't the same as it is today. So people looked at Florida and said, this is a place where we can start investing in land. We can buy up a bunch of land here for very cheap prices. And eventually, this land will get purchased by developers, people who wanted to create retirement communities, people who wanted to create resort communities, people who would ultimately create Disney World and stuff like that. All of this stuff, all of this land will become incredibly valuable at some point. But right now, it's really cheap. So if you get in early on the land, you'll do pretty well. So a lot of people, there was this big rush to buy land in Florida in 1925 and 1926. Now, a lot of these people did the same thing that people did with the stock market, in that some people bought land by just going, if a plot of land is $10,000, they go to a broker and say, here's my $10,000. I want to buy that plot of land. But other people took mortgages out to buy that land, which is the equivalent of buying stocks on margin. As long as the value of that land is $10,000 or higher, then you're not going to have a problem. Or if it's worth what your mortgage is, you're fine. You're not going to wind up being upside down on that purchase. But if land values start to decline, you're going to be in real trouble, because even if you sold your land, if you sold the investment, you're not going to be able to pay off your loan. So there's a similarity to the stock market crash in that regard. And what wound up happening here is that Forbes magazine started looking at the purchase of land in Florida, and they concluded that if you were a short-term investor, you absolutely should not get involved in Florida. They said you're a sucker if you're buying it, if you're buying a plot of land via a mortgage, because it's going to be years before this ever pays off. Forbes uncovered a huge problem in Florida in that they did not have a real comprehensive connected railroad system. There was simply too many different railroad companies that were operating that had the same track gauge problems that we talked about in the first lectures of this semester. So they said there's no way that railroad companies are going to be able to get equipment down here. They're going to be able to get people down here. They're going to be able to get all sorts of material down here. It's not going to happen. And the railroads, for their part, actually got involved in this and said, we're not even going to wait around. We're going to declare an embargo. We will simply not serve Florida. We're just not going to do it. So all of a sudden, these things with Forbes saying this is a bad idea, this is a bad investment, and then those railroads getting involved and saying we're not going to run anything into Florida, all of a sudden land values start to decline. The IRS investigated what was going on in Florida. The IRS investigated in large part because they had a lot of people who were challenging their tax valuations, who were claiming that they'd been defrauded. So the IRS started looking at this and concluded, yeah, some people were actually being defrauded, and put out in one of their bulletins that basically it was their recommendation, don't buy land in Florida. This again caused land values to go down. And then what always happens in Florida happened in 1926 and early 1927. I shouldn't say in early 1927. In 1926 and 1927, Florida had a particularly bad year of hurricanes. And this wound up putting a lot of that land underwater for extended periods of time. There were not seawalls that were built up or anything, and land values plummeted. And there was just this mass of mortgages. There were mortgages that were being defaulted upon, and foreclosures on all of this land. So there's a massive foreclosure problem. All of this land is dropping in value. People can't get out of it. And in order to get out, some people are selling their land at whatever they can get for them. The lucky ones were people who actually had cash, who could also, once they sold their land, they could also go to the bank, get cash, and pay off the rest of their loan. Those were the lucky ones. But most of these people didn't have cash on hand. They were counting on this paying off as an investment, and it just didn't pay off. This is exactly what is going to happen with the stock market crisis. It's just 2 years earlier. Now, on top of that, there was a problem in terms of interlocking banking structures in the United States. There were, between 1920 and 1929, there were 30,000 banks that opened. And in 1929 alone, there were 5,000 bank failures in the United States. There was no such thing as deposit insurance. There was no FDIC in this era. So when a bank wound up having what was called a bank run, when people would come to the bank and say, look, I need to take out money to pay off a margin call, or to pay off a debt on one of these loans, like a loan for Florida. If a bank ran out of money, they've only got two choices. First of all, banks don't actually keep all of the money that they take in on deposits. I hope all of you know this. What they do when people deposit money is that money, some of it obviously stays at the bank so that they can do some basic day-to-day transactions and handle the cash needs of their surrounding community. But most of the money that gets taken in gets put to work for the bank. They wind up being loaned out for car loans or home loans, or purchases of stocks, or purchase of plots of land in Florida. So their deposit base, let's say they've got $1 million worth of depositors. That doesn't mean they've got $1 million sitting in that bank. Okay. They may only have a couple of 100,000 sitting in that bank, if that. So when people come in and start saying, look, I need to take my money out, if they run out of money at the bank, if they literally run out of cash, you've got two options. They can borrow money from another bank, or they can simply flip the closed sign over and say, this bank is no longer in business. Now, a lot of banks chose to borrow money from another bank, and this tied the fortunes of those two banks together. So what we see, if you look on the screen here, what we see is a circumstance where a bank, like the first one here, might wind up having an operating deficit because they've loaned out so much money. And when depositors come in to try to take money out, they run short. So what do? They borrow money from the second bank. But this first bank is now a liability to the second bank. If the first bank winds up becoming so unstable that it goes out of business, well, it's a problem for bank number two, because they're never going to get the money back that they loaned to the first bank. So bank two has no choice. Well, they have the two choices again. They can flip their sign over that says we're closed for good if we run out of money, or they can go to a third bank and borrow money from that third bank. Once again, if the second bank goes under, because it's a liability for this third bank, it can cause real problems for this third bank. That's what the interlocking nature is all about. Okay. These banks are tied to one another. So a small bank going down could take out another set of banks, which ultimately is going to leave only the largest banks in the country with enough operating capital to still be viable. They're the only ones that are going to have enough cash to be able to weather a storm like an economic crisis. So small and medium-sized banks just fall apart. And during the Great Depression era, this becomes a huge problem for the United States. Sorry about that. So banks wind up having a real problem during the Great Depression era. Now, something else that winds up being a problem in the United States is there are some bigger structural problems in the nation's economy. The bigger structural problems are things like industrial production going way up throughout the 1920s, but wages not keeping up with that production. Industrial wages in the United States, the bulk of the wages paid to the middle class, they wind up stagnating in this country. And stagnation it's just a straight line. Okay. There's no growth, there's no decline, but there's no growth either. And that's a problem. Once again, if we just kind of think about this in a graphical standpoint, if the red line that I'm drawing represents industrial production and the green line that I'm drawing represents the basic economy, if it represents the wages that people are being paid, there's going to be a gap, this area in between the production and the wages. That gap is going to create economic problems. Now, you can fill in the gap. You can have people consume. This is where consumption actually happens. You can have some consumption, but the way you fill this gap in terms of consumption is you do things like you establish consumer credit. You have people buying things, buying cars, buying houses, buying later on, not in the 1920s, but buying television sets or washers and dryers. You have them buying this stuff on consumer credit. It can fill in the gap, but there's also a problem. If the wages stagnate and something catastrophic happens, like every company decides to cut their industrial production down and they start laying people off, all of these people who have consumed all of these goods by borrowing money, they're not going to be able to pay it back. So this increased production, along with the stagnation that comes with it in terms of wages, is setting the United States up for a crisis. We have a redistribution of wealth as well that goes upward as opposed to across the middle class. This is not a class of course, about the 1% versus the 99%, but it is a sort of useful metric in terms of trying to understand wage distribution. In 1919, the wealthiest 1% in this country controlled 20% of the nation's income. By 1929, they controlled 30% of the nation's income. So they had seen a 50% income increase during that decade, where the bulk of Americans, again, saw stagnant wages. For the wealthy, this is great. This is fine. They're not going to be hurt during the Great Depression. But the problem with the wealthy is this. They're called the 1%. They're one percenters because there just aren't that many of them. They are not the key to consumption in the national economy. If consumption just grinds to a halt, which it's going to during a Depression era economy, if it grinds to a halt, the wealthy are not going to be able to consume enough to get the economy back in business. That's why even in the modern era, when you hear people from both parties talking about what the solution to quote economic crises are, what the solutions are, it always begins and ends with how do you get the middle class consuming. Now, they both take different paths towards that, but both of them understand that you have to have the middle class consuming. Otherwise, economic recovery just is not going to happen. Now, there's also something else that involves these wealthy people. They are making more money than they've ever made by the time the Great Depression begins. And they start speculating in loans. They understand that some redistribution has to actually happen. And they start speculating in loans all across the globe. They start speculating in loans in Latin America. They start speculating in loans to help Germany repay their war debt from World War I. And it's really problematic because it doesn't wind up creating a cycle of productive capitalism. And the economist who figured out all of this, who understood how this was going to work, was a guy named John Maynard Keynes. Now, John Maynard Keynes was a British economist, and he wrote a book following World War I called The Economic Consequences of the Peace. Keynes was a member of the British delegation to the Paris Peace Conference after World War I. And Keynes was utterly opposed to the idea of Germany paying a war debt, that they should be paying any sort of that they should be paying anything to the Allies as a punishment for World War I. There should be no reparations, he said. However, obviously he gets voted down. And Keynes wrote in the book, The Economic Consequences of the Peace, he said the reparations are ultimately going to cause a global economic crisis. But he did also point out that there is a way out of the crisis that will be created here. He pointed out that economic downturns, are not cyclical. A lot of people truly believed that economic downturns was just up and down, it was fate. There really wasn't much you could do about it. But Keynes pointed out, no, of course you can do something about it. When there are economic downturns, the government absolutely can get involved, and they should deficit spend to pull the government or to pull the economy out of the crisis. Now, Keynes pointed out, when people said, oh, you can't deficit spend, Keynes pointed out, of course you can. The government literally is the only body that's allowed to, quote, print money. And he pointed out that there have been numerous occasions across different countries and across time where governments deficit spend, like during wars, for example. He said governments always deficit spend. So there's no reason why we shouldn't deficit spend here as well. So governments should absolutely do this. On the other hand, what the United States government did during all of this was they made the situations worse. The government, for example, the United States Congress looked at this and said, well, the problem is that Americans are not buying American goods. And the reason they're not buying American goods is because there's too much competition from foreign manufacturers. So Congress passed something called the Smoot-Hawley tariff, a tax on imported goods, which only made the situation worse because a lot of imported goods, countries across the world looked at that and said, all right, if you're going to tax the goods that we're exporting to you, then we'll tax the goods that you're trying to export to us. So, for example, American cotton farmers are going to get hit really hard by this because cotton prices are going to go, they're going to plummet because of these taxes. The profits that the farmers make are going to plummet because of this sort of stuff. Now, Keynes also pointed out, and you're just going to have to bear with me on this map that I show you here, these next couple of maps. Keynes also said, if you guys are really hell-bent on reparations, there's really only one way that reparations will actually work. And before we get to what actually happened, let's look at what Keynes proposed first. Keynes said that there's only one country that can actually finance the debt. Germany got hit with a bill of $34 billion that they owed to the Allies. Germany had no chance of being able to pay this. So Keynes understood that the United States is going to wind up refinancing this debt, which they do in something called the Dawes Plan, another Dawes Plan. And what Keynes said should happen is this: the United States has all of this money that they're going to spend on this so-called Dawes Plan. They're going to send that money from the US to Germany. Okay, just follow the purple lines, if you will. What Germany should do with the money that they get, the money they're borrowing from the United States, Germany should take that money, they should put it into their banks, they should engage in entrepreneurial lending, they should engage in infrastructure programs. What they ought to be doing is creating jobs by doing this. This will build up their industrial capacity. It'll employ large numbers of German peoples. Those German people who now have jobs will become taxpayers. Those taxpayers generate revenue for the state. And then that revenue that's generated, the taxes that these people are paying, that is what should be used to pay back Great Britain and what should be used to pay back France. Now, when France and Great Britain get the money from Germany, what they ought to do is take that money and invest it in their infrastructure, put it into their banks and build up and engage in entrepreneurial lending, build up their industrial capacity, employ large numbers of French people or English people, people who pay taxes, who generate wealth or generate income for the state. And then they should use that money that's generated and use it to pay back the loans that they took out from the United States during World War I. At every step along the way, you're using excess capital to build more capital. That's what capitalism is all about. It's about using excess capitalism to build more capital. However, Keynes privately said, you guys probably won't do this. And in fact, they don't. What winds up happening is just a very simple line. The United States says, yes, we will refinance your debt. And they appropriate money and send it to Germany. Germany then takes that money they borrowed from the United States and says, here you go, England. Here you go, France. England and France take the money that they've got and go, here you go, US. So what's wound up happening in this scenario is, let's just think about it. Who's paying the United States back? And I'll give you a second to think about it. I actually gave you 5 seconds. Who's paying the United States back? The US is paying itself back with all of this. This is generating nothing. Okay, there's nothing productive about all of this. So it winds up becoming the disaster that Keynes foretold. He said this is going to drag the entire globe into an economic catastrophe. And it's all in that book, The Economic Consequences of the Peace. Keynes said, I've got a plan. If you follow it, this might work. If you don't, it absolutely won't work. And people didn't follow the plan. Now, in addition to things like the Smoot-Hawley tariff, the president of the United States at this time was a guy named Herbert Hoover. And Hoover is often given a bad rap on some level. He's talked about as a president who did basically nothing while the Great Depression was going on. And I think that kind of sells Hoover a little bit short. Herbert Hoover had been the Secretary of Commerce in the 1920s under a president named Warren Harding. He had also, during World War I, he had been a private businessman. He had wound up becoming independently wealthy and wound up basically working for charities by this point. He worked for the American Red Cross, for example, and wound up being in charge of getting charitable donations to literally feed Europe and to get medicine to Europe and all of this. And he had seen just the massive amounts of charitable donations, and he became convinced, with good reason, that Americans are very charitable people. And whenever we have these crises, the answer is the private sector and charities. Okay. Now, he had every reason to believe this. But ultimately, what Hoover came to conclude, he didn't do nothing about all of this. He simply waited too long to do something because Hoover did not like the idea of using the government as an instrument for this stuff. Hoover was not a progressive, quote unquote. He didn't believe that the government could be used as an instrument for reform. He believed that the idea of having the government step in on all of this stuff, that is the last option that we should use. So he appealed to businessmen to keep wages high, to keep their staffing levels high. He said, look, it is an economic downturn. It's bad, but we're all kind of in this. So if you just keep your employees there, we'll get out of this crisis, as that downturn will ultimately turn into an upturn and everybody will succeed. He points out to these guys, you guys are you're still making plenty of money. None of you are insolvent. So you're all just going to have to ride this out together. And these businessmen would say the right things while they were with Hoover, but then they'd go home and they'd completely ignore the promises that they made to Hoover. So ultimately, Hoover did turn to the government as a solution, and he got Congress to create something called the Reconstruction Finance Corp, which was going to provide loans to various businesses to keep the business afloat, to help with payroll costs and the like. The administration put in charge of this Reconstruction Finance Corp a Houstonian named Jesse Jones, and this group winds up getting a total of $2 billion appropriated by Congress for these purposes. $2 billion sounds like an awful lot of money, and it is. I don't want to suggest it's not. But think about how much money was lost in the stock market crash alone. In those 2 days, on October 24th, remember, it was $11 billion. On October 29th, it was $200 billion. So $2 billion is simply not even close to enough to make a difference. Hoover also got Congress to create something called the Federal Home Loan Bank System. The rationale being, home purchases are a good economic indicator. If you've got home purchases going up, there's going to be, that obviously means that people are buying houses, but they're also buying all of the consumer goods that you use to fill those houses. They're buying furniture, they're buying appliances, they're buying rugs, they're buying beds, everything you can think of. Okay, so it's an indicator of consumption. So Hoover understood people are buying houses, that's good. So we're going to emphasize this. We're going to get people to buy homes. But again, Congress only appropriates $500 million for it. That's spitting into the wind. It's not going to make a difference here. Okay. And ultimately, Herbert Hoover wound up coming to the conclusion, even while he was saying that, look, maybe we did need more government solutions, he also wound up being moved to say that the problem with capitalists is that they're too damned greedy. He wound up writing editorials in the 1930s when he was out of office saying that, look, I tried everything we possibly could from a volunteerism standpoint, and these people backstabbed me in all of it. So Hoover didn't really do, quote, nothing. The big problem for Hoover is that he's coming at it with too little, too late. Now, as I've mentioned here, the Great Depression was a global economic crisis. It wasn't just something that affects the United States. It affects everybody across the world. So when we're dealing with the responses to the Great Depression, it's more than just what the United States does with things like the Reconstruction Finance Corp and the federal home loan system, and the reliance on volunteerism, stuff like that. There's more to it than that. Across the globe, countries engaged in three basic responses to this problem: fascism, totalitarian communism, and welfare capitalism. And we're going to talk about these from the most basic standpoints that there could possibly be. We're not going to go into a ton of detail on them. I can tell you, if you went into an economics class and talked about them from this standpoint, your professor would probably tell you that you've got a decent, minimal understanding of this, but it's certainly not a broad perspective on all of this stuff. So let's start with fascism. Fascism is actually kind of the flip side of the coin when it comes to capitalism. There is still private investment in the economy. People can take their own money, they can invest it in businesses, and if those businesses pay off, they reap the benefits. Those private investors reap the benefits. The difference in fascism is that while the economy is in private hands, from that perspective, the government regulates and controls the economy. The government steps in and does a ton of regulatory functions. For example, if you have a fictional country where the basic raw material produced out of that country is something that makes the material that makes blue paint, then what they're going to do is the government is going to prop up in industry, whatever industry we're talking about. They're going to say the cars have to be painted blue. And if you don't paint your cars blue, there's a surcharge on them. If you're going to produce brooms, you can produce brooms, but the broomstick handles have to be painted blue. If you're going to make rubber balls in this country, they have to be blue. There's surcharges against companies that produce red rubber balls, for example. So the government is going to regulate and direct the economy. You can still take your money and say, well, I don't want to put it into rubber balls. I want to put it into the car company. You're free to do that. And if that company takes off, you're going to get to keep the profits, but the government is going to regulate it. Now, and for what it's worth, before we move on to the next one, for what it's worth, Italy employed fascism. Germany employed fascism when the Nazis came in. Japan employed fascism. Spain employed fascism to a much, much, much lesser extent. The United States employed some elements of fascism, although Franklin Roosevelt rejected calls on him to fully implement fascism in the economy. But whenever fascism was implemented in these countries, it seemed to work. People seemed to benefit from it. Now, as we're going to see with totalitarian communism, on some level, they're seeing what the leaders of these countries want them to see. But since people on the outside looking in are seeing that there's less suffering, that people seem to have jobs, that they seem to be able to consume, they're going to look at this and say, well, maybe this is a viable option. Totalitarian communism is the next idea. During the Great Depression, the Soviet Union, under Joseph Stalin, implemented a planned economy to try to industrialize the Soviet Union and to collectivize agriculture. Now, to do this, the cost for the Soviet Union was 20 million lives. It wound up killing up to 20 million people in the countryside regions. But the plan was very simple. The economy is not in private hands. There will be state-owned industries, a state-owned automobile industry, for example, a state-owned broom-making industry, a state-owned rubber ball making company. And the government will decide who works where and who gets paid what. And more importantly, not only do they direct this, but remember, they own the economy. The state owns the economy. So the state determines who gets paid what. And the plan is that everybody gets paid enough to meet the basic necessities of life. Okay, that people are not going to be shut out from being able to afford rent, afford a car, afford food, all that sort of stuff. Because the government, when the profits come into these companies, the government theoretically distributes them equally across the population. Now, once again, this is a circumstance where it appeared to be working. Okay. Western journalists saw what Joseph Stalin wanted them to see. So they took away from this that, yes, this is obviously working. So when socialists in the United States started talking about, well, maybe we should implement socialism here, maybe we should have greater elements of communism within our order, American workers were willing to listen to this because they had seen what appeared to be successes. And then the third option is the idea of welfare capitalism. Sweden, Great Britain, Canada, and again, to a lesser extent, the United States all took this path. Now, essentially what happens in welfare capitalism is that the government maintains a capitalist economy. They don't come in and completely regulate. They certainly don't take state ownership of the economy. What they do is create a safety net under capitalism. There's an understanding in welfare capitalism that some people are going to lose out because that's the way capitalism works. There are going to be people who lose out, but some of those people lose out through no fault of their own. So the safety net that welfare capitalism provides will protect those who fall through because of things that are beyond their control. So there's going to be bankruptcy protections. There's going to be unemployment protections. There's going to be things like old age pensions within welfare capitalism to take care of those who are unable to take care of themselves. So the Great Depression itself transforms the United States economy and transforms the United States government as well. In 1928, the Democratic Party's nominee for the presidency was a guy named Al Smith from New York. He was absolutely crushed in the 1928 election. Herbert Hoover destroyed him in that election. And Smith's successor as both governor of New York and as the Democratic Party's nominee in 1932 was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt wound up defeating Herbert Hoover overwhelmingly. And in doing so, Roosevelt's victory transformed the United States. Roosevelt promised what he referred to as the New Deal for the United States. Now, just look at all of the things, look at the screen and see all of the things that are created through the New Deal. Okay, this is an utterly transformative moment. Things like old age pensions in the United States get created under the New Deal. Unemployment compensation through the Social Security Act of 1935. Aid for dependent children, what we commonly refer to as welfare today. School lunch programs, insured bank deposits, the idea that if you go in and you put your money into the bank, it's there, it's safe there. That's a huge deal for the United States. The creation of minimum wage laws, union recognition, stock market regulation to make sure that something like the stock market crash doesn't happen again. The creation of a Federal Communication Commission to streamline government communication with the people. Even things like federal housing programs get created under this New Deal. The Great Depression was what historians, intellectual historians, refer to as a, quote, watershed moment. It was this moment where everything changes, okay? The Civil War had brought about a sentiment in the American economy that was called laissez-faire, that the government stays out of people's business, that the government has no role to play in the day-to-day business life in the United States. However, the Great Depression completely reversed this. The Great Depression held that government intervention is going to be the key to getting out of the problem, getting out of the crisis. So if anything comes out as a legacy of the Great Depression itself, we're not talking about the New Deal. The legacy of the Great Depression is government intervention. It reverses the idea of laissez-faire. Now, this is going to be, since the Great Depression is such a big event, I'm going to break it up into two lectures. This is going to be the end of part one of the Great Depression. When we come back, we'll deal with part two of the Great Depression. So come back for that. Incidentally, we're going to do the same thing with World War II. We're going to break it up into two parts. So come back for part two of the Great Depression and New Deal.